Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Jon Askonas, who is an assistant professor of politics at the Catholic University of America, where he works on the connections between the Republican tradition, technology, and national security. Jon Askonas, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks so much for having me on.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Jon, will cover the Republican tradition and technology. But before we get into these topics, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape?
Sure, and I know that you have a lot of the national security professionals who are part of the IPA. I think we're at a very unique moment in world history. And there was this notion after the 2000s that some had called the unipolar moment, this moment of global American hegemony, where there was really no peer competitor, was coming to an end. And I think what we're finding out is that either isn't true, or if it's true in a very complicated way. Because even though some countries like China, and we thought Russia, maybe not so much Russia, are in a position to contest some of our military power, American control over the global information space, broadly understood, encompassing culture, entertainment, actual, informational hardware, networks, including space communications networks, financial networks, most importantly, internet platforms. American control over those spaces has actually never been greater than it is today. And so I think what we are confronting is a geopolitical situation where power in the form of control of energy and manufacturing capability is more distributed than it was certainly in 1995, but that control over the information space is actually more centralized and more concentrated in the United States than it is. And I think this is a kind of power that we're very uncomfortable wielding and that we haven't fully understood.
Your research, as we mentioned up at the top, resides at the intersection of the Republican tradition, technology, and national security. I think it might be helpful to define what the Republican tradition means and talk about why did you choose to study this confluence of concepts?
Yeah, so and for those listening at home, this is a small R Republican tradition. This country was founded as a republic. It was actually founded as the first republic of its kind, really, in 1776 and sort of refounded in 1789. And in doing so, the founding fathers were partaking in this revived tradition of political thinking that came out of the Italian Renaissance and then had various offshoots in England and Western Europe, that in a modification of the ancient notion of republic. So the ancient notion of republicanism, right, is a state where the public interest rules, the res publica, the things in common, right, and there isn't a king. There's a shared participation in government, not just in the form of voting, but in the form of public virtue and public mindedness, right? And the kind of Renaissance renewal of this idea is to layer on the notion of kind of Republican institutions on top of it. So we're not merely relying on the virtue of the citizenship in resisting corruption, and the tradition, in the Western tradition of political thinking, is full of ways that corruption destroys republics. And the founding fathers, it was very front of mind for them. And so this modern version of republicanism layers on an institutional level to restrain some of those corrupting influences. This is where we get the idea of separation of powers. This is where we get the idea of federalism and a kind of balance between local communities and sort of centralized power. And this Republican tradition has lots of requirements, right? You find in people like in Montesquieu, in in Rousseau, in any of the kind of great, there's a number of like Sidney Hook, a lot of like English Republican theorists, they write about the kinds of things that can unbalance republics, that can lead to corruption, that can lead to the degradation of a republic into oligarchy or into tyranny or some other regime of some other form of government.
Would you include Burke in the Republican
Absolutely.
tradition?
Yeah. I think, I mean, he's yeah. I mean, there's in the 18th century, you also begin to go from this Republican tradition to thinking about kind of classical liberalism. But those 18th century classical liberals are very much interacting with and building on top of this Republican tradition.
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
So obviously, the founders weren't reading Burke because Burke was a contemporary of.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah.
Yep.
But a couple of those things that can really unbalance republics are massive changes in geopolitical fortune, massive changes in the institutions of security, especially armies. And there's one of the reasons why the founders, for example, make a distinction between the Department of War and the Department of the Navy is their understanding of the unique danger that armies pose to the republic that navies don't. There's never been a coup. I think there's been one coup in all of history that was led by an admiral, right? So that's a small example of this, and things that change the relationships between citizens, right? The legal equality of citizens is a key component of this Republican tradition, but it rests also on the efficacy of self-government, the efficacy of structures that build virtue in the citizenry. And so rapid technological development and significant changes in our national security institutions that come in the 20th century in the United States have had a destabilizing effect on many of our kind of traditions of self-government. Now, those things happen for good reasons. I don't think you can simply put your head in the sand and say, I wish we hadn't done it this way. But I do think it's vital, incumbent on us that we try to understand the way that, for example, the creation of the volunteer army or the creation of a permanent intelligence apparatus change our form of government. When it comes to information, for instance, some of our best thinkers on information, like Neil Postman, have written about how central it was to the American political tradition, the kinds of literacy and the kinds of media that we had. I mean, America was really the first society that was born literate in all of history. The first society that from its founding was a highly literate, a print society, right? That print culture has completely been destroyed by technology at this point. And certainly I see this in my students. I mean, I think it's hard for you and I to appreciate it. We're sort of the last vestiges. We're the last people who, in our primary school education and our secondary education, we're being educated without recourse to computers and the internet, and therefore in a situation where print was still central to being educated. That's gone now. That's going to have massive political implications that we need to be thinking about now.
There's an analog for that that I was just witness to. I just got back from a conference which was with the Space Force. And so the Space Force is like a mini version of what you were just describing, not related to consumption of print media, but the Space Force is a new service. And probably 98% of the personnel within Space Force were previously Air Force because they matriculated over to the Space Force. And there were some Army and Navy folks also who have also joined the Space Force. But there are also just now starting to be people who are enlisting or becoming officers like from day one as Space Force guardians. And so that's going to have the same kind of dynamic that you were just describing, except related to print media.
Yeah, that's right. There's a great quote from Marshall Mcluhan, the great media theorist, that there is no difference that does not difference make. Even small sort of changes in technology or structure or context can lead to massive differences in the long term.
Oh, wow. Yeah, for sure. Well, so this kind of leads me into the next thing I wanted to ask you about it. But this is another big, huge open question. But how do you think AI and machine learning is impacting national security?
Obviously, this is a huge question, and I think even AI and ML is at this point it's a bucket of technologies. So, for example,
Mhm.
the real breakthroughs in AI and ML in national security in the 2000s were much more in the frame of network analysis technologies, of big data analysis, of visual classification. I'm sure your listeners, so many of them are familiar with the ways that this is critical in the war on terror. Sifting through petabytes of uh, of metadata to find terrorist networks in that data, whether it's phone calls, internet traffic, or financial records. In Iraq and Afghanistan, using really some of the earliest, kind of machine learning, visual classification technologies to build systems that could, follow a car through a video over a long span of time, or to automate some of that kind of analysis, or they could do facial recognition in a quick way. That's one bucket of technologies. All the big breakthroughs in the last few years have been in these transformer models, and now of course large language models, which is there are different versions of deep learning and neural networks, so they're kind of from the same branch of AI, but they're going in a vastly different direction. I mean, I think that as usual, the biggest impacts on national security will not be the obvious ones, and they will not be the ones that come from within national security. They'll be the things that come in the back door through massive political, economic, and cultural changes. Right? There are political movements that have not yet arisen that will depend on this technology that will have huge implications for national security, cultural movements, religious movements, even. So I think it's far too early to really say for certain what that looks like. I think it's going to depend a lot on things like on structural unemployment and changes in kind of the American economy. It's going to depend on how we react in terms of what AI and ML do to the information space, right? So there's obviously in one sense in which it's posed to even more than the information space is already overwhelmed by fake content or bot produced content or algorithmically aimed content. It's gonna 100x that. But then there's going to be a backlash, and I do think that when we think about this, we have to think about not just the form but also the backlash, right? There are technologies that already exist that will make it easier to, or can tether identities to speakers, right? I mean, this is what I don't necessarily agree with him, but this is what Sam Altman, the founder of OpenAI, thinks, right? He's separately building this technology called WorldCoin, which is supposed to use retinal scans to tie individual humans to wallets, with the idea that this will be sort of the foundation of identity on the new internet, so that we can distinguish between AI speakers and human speakers. So, I think that I think that we will. It's such a big change, like the printing press. It's very difficult to say where all it's going to go.
Yeah, yeah. 100% on all that. Well said. So I came across your work, Jon, by listening to another podcast, and I've got a link in the show notes to Dmitry Kafinas's Hidden Forces podcast. And to our audience, it's one of my favorite podcasts. It's consistently really good, talking about various different aspects of our culture today and the forces that are at work, whether we realize it or not. But anyway, I heard you on his podcast, and so I certainly suggest people check that out. One of the things that you guys were talking about is what I'm distilling as like a homogenization process that is being partially driven by technology and just our culture today. But I wanted to kind of set up this question by describing another couple of homogenization processes which I've thought about over the years. And one, being a military guy, the militaries and maybe institutions in general, as people get more senior within the military or various different institutions, there's this homogenization process where people at the top tend to be relatively similar in their outlook and the way that they engage with the world, because the military selects for people who are similar, and so there's this homogenization process. So that's one. But there's also a, a technology homogenization process that I've observed, and there's probably lots of examples of this, but the one that comes to mind for me is like vehicle structure, vehicle configuration. And as consumers, purchasers of vehicles want vehicles that perform better, have better gas mileage, can fit more stuff. There's this homogenization process. If you look out over the Walmart parking lot or anywhere across America, and you gaze across the vehicles, they all look so similar. Across all the brands, similar size, similar shape. It's pretty remarkable. And so I think that is an emergent process, as vehicle manufacturers are all striving to meet consumer demand, and what comes out is something that winds up being rather similar. You could probably say the same thing for like online content, like Netflix or Hulu or these various different streaming platforms. The content is not identical, but the way it's structured, the way it unfolds, the way you have like either these like mini series are popping up, or anyway, I'm starting to see kind of like a template emerging on the way shows are structured. It's like the first couple of episodes of a series tend to be really fast paced and interesting, and then when you get to the third or fourth episode, they start telling backstories. Oh, let's deep dive into the characters' backstories, and that's how they kind of extend it out. Anyway, so I'm kind of rambling there, but my question to you is, using what I was just kind of saying as maybe a touch point, what are some of the homogenization dynamics? What types of dynamics are you observing culturally and technologically?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this homogenization process, as you said, it's an emergent process, and I think it's driven at multiple levels. So you see this, to some extent, homogenization is not the thing to be explained. Homogenization might be almost a sort of natural human tendency. We have this sort of herd instinct. What kept homogenization apart was, I think, two things. One, stronger barriers and differentiations between cultures and between parts of cultures. And these aren't just communicative barriers. They're also things like trade and tariff barriers, barriers to market access, right? And then distinctive visions of related to that, distinctive visions of the good, right? Of what makes a good car, what makes a good piece of art, what makes a good TV show, or whatnot. So I think that the kind of communications, the process of globalization, of developing a single global communications architecture related to a single global trade architecture, is kind of one of the huge forces driving homogenization. So there's that. And this is also, that's also sort of a class dynamic. One of the interesting things you see, right, is you used to have more differentiation between companies, all the way down to the level of, you had people who spent 20, 30, 40 years at the same company, right? In that span of time, you can develop an ethos of what makes a GM man or a Ford man or a Honda man or whatnot. But now, in the auto industry and every other industry, you have a huge increase in lateral transfers and lateral hires at every level, including it in the C-suite, at the highest level, executive level within a company, right? And so, in so doing, you are breaking down some of those factors that can lead to distinctiveness. So that's the kind of second level. The third level, I'd say, is the shared information space, including shared metrics and ways of assessing these things. So, one of the factors driving homogenization for automobiles is simply better wind tunnels and better simulations of aerodynamics, right? That used to be extremely costly, extremely computationally costly, and now it's not. And so every car gets produced with pretty significant wind tunnel testing, and it turns out that, given certain parameters of number, interior space and engine size or whatever. There's only so many ways to make a car that meet sort of they're maximally aerodynamically efficient. Better data in the form of analytics, right? We know what people click on, what people look at, what causes people to go to the website to find out more information. Obviously, we have sales data, right? And so suddenly, now the kind of the blind alley that you get drawn into here is that there's a power law distribution here, right? Where for your median product, pursuing average is a winning strategy, but you're giving up those sort of tail gains. So you're not going to have to continue the auto metaphor, right? You're not going to have a what was called the Edsel,
Okay,
hugely. You're not going to have a massive flop of a vehicle this way, but you're also not going to produce something that's truly new and distinctive and market changing, creating a new product category. You're not going to have a runaway success with this approach either. So I guess I think one of the things driving homogenization is that the analytics now are so strong about how to produce that kind of marginally better hit, that people are not given the permission to swing for the fences. And here's the thing, like that swinging for the fences it's probably a bad individual bet. It probably on net loses money. Like 95% of those bets probably fail. But it's those 5% that succeed drive all of the culture forward. And I think that's the thing that I'm most worried about, is that we're sort of in this cultural dead end because we're not taking those risks on outlier ideas.
There's a risk component to everything that you're saying, and the creators, the capitalists, tend to be risk averse when mass marketing to people and trying to make money and keep their businesses afloat. But this is having an effect of stifling innovation. And what did you call it? Like a cultural dead end? Was that it?
Yeah, sort of cultural dead end, I think. You see this in music. I mean, the music critic Ted Gioia has been writing about this on his Substack. I mean, one shocking example, right, is for several years running, Ed Sheeran's song "Shape of You" from 2017 has been the top hit, right? Just like it's a song everybody loves on a lot of playlists, maybe. That's unheard of in the history of modern popular music. It's unheard of that you would have a song from any previous year, except the immediate previous year, maybe, be the top hit, much less several years in a row, right? That's and that's even before you get to data on kind of how popular music is sort of converging along the same set of tones, the same set of beats, the same RPMs or BPMs. So there is this algorithmic convergence.
Yeah. There's a really humorous and illustrative video along those lines. I'll have to find it and put it in the show notes. But these fellas, I think it's three guys. They're like musicians slash comedians, but they have this really nifty video where they talk about how like many songs can be distilled down to like 3 simple chords, or maybe it's 4 chords or something like that, and they play the 4 chords, and then they basically just like riff off of those 4 chords in different ways and overlay in real time, and they're doing this live, but they overlay like probably 25 or 30 different popular songs just by riffing those chords in different ways. And I guess that seems to support your point that there is a formula to some of this, and the formula must simultaneously help with engagement with the marketplace, right? This is what 85% of the people like this, so let's just go where the eyeballs and the earballs are, okay, number one. But those chords would not have resonated in the first place if there wasn't something to it where it was pleasing to our sensibilities or something, right? And so it's basically just like figuring out what works and then like, okay, let's just exploit that. Let's just run with it because there seems to be something to it.
Well, but the thing that's worrying, right, is it's not what works, but what worked, right? It's always in
Okay.
reference point. No, it's always
Yeah,
in reference
yeah.
point to the past, right? This is my friend Michael Sakostas has written about this, about how, you know, to live online is to live in the past, in the sense that, you know, the information available to us in the form of data, in the form of the internet, is always in reference to this massive archive we're building of all past experience. But now we're indexing everything against the past. So it might be that, as you, to use your example, you know, those chords were pleasing in some foundational, essential way.
Yes.
Or it could be that that was a new sound at that moment in time, right? But then if we're now indexing all of our new music to this one moment in time, then suddenly this just becomes the way music sounds, right? And we're not, you know, that actually creates an opportunity for someone who's willing to come along and actually pursue a kind of new sound potentially. But if you're always tweaking it back towards this archive of the past, what you're doing is sort of anchoring culture in one moment in time and dragging everything new back towards that direction.
Right.
So I think this is quite a reversal from, you know, I think this is a huge reversal from the broadcast era, particularly the television era, where what you were always being drawn to was the now, right? It was, you know, television was a medium without any history. It's actually very difficult to archive television. A lot of television wasn't live, but it was shown once and then it was sort of over, or it was, maybe you'd have some reruns for television shows, but not for a lot of stuff, not for the news, not for late night shows, not for whatever. And so that created this movement towards the now, which dominated the culture of television. And now I think we've entered a very different kind of era.
Yeah. Well, so I want to vector this conversation more towards influence and bring up the topic of reflexive control. And to our audience, I did not realize this when I did my research for this discussion, but Jon told me before we started talking that it turns out he's got some deep research history into Russia and the former Soviet Union. So he is familiar with what reflexive control is. And so the way I understand reflexive control, it's a technique that was developed within the Soviet Union, and it might have roots going even before Soviet times. But it is an analytic technique that involves understanding a opponent's decision-making processes and manipulating information in such a way so that when information is delivered to an opponent in a game setting, or it could be in a geopolitical setting, but when information is delivered, you understand what your opponent is going to do with that information, and so the outcome is essentially predetermined. And one of the silly examples that I like to use with reflexive control, and I mean, this is like an obvious example. It's not especially useful in reality or in the context of like global influence. But if you were to go up to somebody and you were to like wave your hand right in front of their face, like right in front of their eyes, you would know in advance that that person is going to blink their eyes, right? Because that is a human natural action, a reaction. That's like a reflective or reflexive reaction, right? And so when you do that, you know exactly what's going to happen. And so this whole conversation that we've been talking about, this homogenization process, you can think of that as like ways to enhance influence reflexively, because people are engaging in the online world, and technology is kind of like herding and forcing us down these narrower pathways of engagement, which makes it easier for influence to happen. Anyway, that's kind of a clumsy introduction to the subject. But Jon, I wanted to get your take on where does your mind go with the conversation we've been having and the concept of reflexive control, and take this wherever you think is productive.
Yeah, so
reflexive control is a part and parcel of a deeper history of Soviet behavioralism. So, which actually I think it ties back in interesting ways to some of the challenges that faced the Tsarist regime and the ways that they responded to those challenges. The Tsarists basically invented modern information operations because in the middle 19th century, the regime perceived that it was vulnerable to revolutionary ideology emanating out of Central and Western Europe, right? And obviously, it couldn't exert. Russia's a big country, very porous borders. It couldn't fully exert. It wasn't going to exert military power. Although it did, in 1848, the Hungarian Revolution, the Tsar sent in, volunteered the Russian army to help the Austro-Hungarian Empire put down this rebellion. So sometimes they were willing to exert military power, but their primary tool of influence was the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police, which invented things which act as agents provocateur, infiltrated revolutionary cells, invented things like the protocols of the elders of Zion, right? That was the Tsarist operation designed to reshape the information space in ways that protected the Tsarist regime. When the Soviets come to power, they face this challenge of, how do we go about remaking Russian society in the image of communism? And it became clear that just as Marxism was sort of a science of economic history, you needed some mechanisms, scientific mechanisms, to reshape society and reshape psychology. And this developed into an offshoot of, in the West, we call a behavioralist research program. So if you've ever heard of Pavlov, as in like Pavlov's dogs, right? He's this great Russian behavioralist. He was that research program received significant support from the Soviet government because it was perceived that mastering the science of shaping behavior through shaping inputs and outputs was a critical element of building a communist sociology or science of society that would enable it to build this kind of communist utopia, right? So that instinct, that desire, you need economic planning. You also need social and psychological planning, right? That's kind of the underlying thread of these developments. Now, in the 40s and 50s, the Soviets became extremely interested in the cybernetics discipline that was emerging in the West. In the West, it emerges out of problems. So cybernetics ultimately is about the science of control under conditions of feedback. It's probably the simplest way to explain it. How do you develop informational systems to achieve results where you're actually using outputs of those systems as inputs, right? This came out of solving technical problems with, the one example is like Norman Wiener worked on anti-aircraft systems during the Second World War, because if you're shooting a flak gun, you need to be aiming where the airplane is going to be when the shell arrives. And it's very difficult for humans to do this on their own. But if you build a certain kind of feedback system, then it actually becomes easy, right? So this is kind of the secret sauce of anti-aircraft gunnery in the Second World War, with these anti-aircraft, very, very primitive computers, mechanical computers, electromechanical computers that acted as feedback loops for the human operators, right? Bombardier sights are kind of a similar technology. So, Wiener and others have this intuition that actually this way of thinking has broader applicability to society coming out of the Second World War, and the Soviets immediately got it because it was an answer to a problem that they had and they had made no progress on, right? The Pavlovian approach of developing behavioral of reflexes was too simplistic and frankly required too much force. You can sort of view the Stalinist society as a kind of giant Pavlovian experiment of using revolutionary terror to remake psychology, but it didn't really work, right? And it required a huge amount of violence, and it was self-destructive. Because cybernetics was perceived as the way you get out of this. And reflexive control was one of these mechanisms that come out of it. And the reflexive there is not just it's not like reflexive in the physiological sense, it's reflexive in the mathematical sense of not assuming that you don't reach an equilibrium when you have a pattern that propagates. You don't reach equilibrium at the end of the first propagation. You have to have back propagation. And so now here's the problem with this. And there's a wonderful book by Dima Adamsky called The Culture of Military Innovation, which is not about information operations at all, but it's completely applicable to information operations. And in that book, he basically says the Russians are very good at theorizing technological change. They are terrible at actually implementing it. So the dirty secret of Russian information operations, from reflexive control to active measures to desinformation and all these things, is that they are terrible at actually implementing them. They are terrible at actually organizing to achieve the things that they theorize, right? Dima, for good measure, suggests that the United States is more effective in almost like mirror imaging and taking on some of these theoretical insights and then actually operationalizing them. I think the United States is far more successful in psychological operations than Russia is or ever has been, right? The revolution in military affairs, which is what Dima is writing about, another example where the Russians theorized it. They never did it. They never were close to doing it, but we actually did it, right?
Right.
I'm happy to talk more about that.
Yeah,
That's my
yeah.
kind of very high level take.
No. That's great stuff, and I appreciate you bringing into the discussion cybernetics. I think this is a sidebar. I think that the term that we use for I'm not sure whether cybernetics is not a great term or just using cyber for everything. Like cyber is kind of like quantum. It's like, people talk quantum this, quantum that, and it may not necessarily be quantum. It just tends to be like a buzzword that gets attached to the beginning of things. Well, cyber can be kind of the same way, but cybernetics is different than what most people think of cyber as.
Well,
And
cybernetics is the original, right? All
yes, that's right.
cybers are,
It's the
yeah,
OG.
yeah, it's the OG. I mean, it comes from Kybernos, the steersman, right, and building robotic systems that actually function in environments. Now, the important thing about cybernetics, which I didn't get to say, was that the program never worked. The research program ultimately failed. But one of the reasons it failed is that once you get a feedback system, so basically it's split off in two directions or three directions, maybe split off into robotics, which at the time you make it work, you had to have very tightly controlled environments, or it broke down very quickly.
And rules.
And rules, yeah, very tightly controlled environments, rules were broke down. It broke off into what we call cognitive science, which took some of the kind of underlying principles but moved it in a more kind of symbological direction. Now, what's interesting is that as we've been able to scale up, compute over the last, over the last 20 years, suddenly, actually, these cybernetic principles become implementable.
Yeah,
right? You can actually build intelligent feedback systems because we have the computational power to model millions of interactions, which was not feasible beforehand.
Right.
So this is the kind of unique moment we're in.
Yeah, there seems to be an analog here with the AI winter.
Yes, absolutely.
Going back to the 1940s and 50s again, many of the machine learning and AI concepts were developed back then by, let's say, things like neural networks were conceived of by guys like Marvin Minsky back in the 1950s. But just like you were saying, just because they were conceptually accurate doesn't mean that they could actually be operationalized, because we just weren't there yet. Same thing with cybernetics.
Well, and there's an even deeper parallel there, right? Which was within AI, there were two paradigms. The symbolic paradigm, which is about let's develop better rules and better ways of encapsulating rules and developing meta rules, and the neural network machine learning approach. And for 1945 until basically 2005, so 60 years, the symbolic approach was seen as the winner, right? Nobody could get the neural network thing working. It was seen as basically computationally infeasible. And then overnight, as computing power ramped up, it switched. And now nobody does the symbolic stuff. And everybody does neural networks. Similarly, after World War II, there were two primary approaches to computing theory: information theory, sort of led by Claude Shannon, and the cybernetics theory led by Norman Wiener. And Shannon was the winner, right? Like, cybernetics paradigm didn't work. Information theory, it worked. You could do all these models of signal and noise. It was foundational to developing modern computing, modern electronics of all kinds. It worked. But we might be coming to a reversal now, where suddenly we now have the computational power. Now the information theory doesn't seem to work as well for the kinds of models that we're trying to develop, but because of the degree of reflexity. But now the cybernetic systems might start working.
Right, right. And so back to your points about inputs and outputs, not to get too technical here, but there's also going back to Russia, Markov and Markov modeling of inputs and outputs with probabilistic flows of information. That goes right into the concept of reflexive control as well, where if you can get somebody, or you've got an audience, or you've got a customer base, or you've got a target population for influence, if you can get a person or hundreds or thousands or millions of people onto a probabilistic pathway, a cybernetic pathway, then you've got some influence or likely outcomes based upon flowing from a cognitive state or activity state A to B to C to D, and that makes influence easier for people who recognize that those dynamics and embrace it and try to operationalize it. Do you think you can take that into, say, like, thinking about the way people engage online and this kind of like herding and forcing kind of a driving towards outcomes? Where does your mind go with that?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing that's often not really understood about reflexive control is that the key to the theory is not the information provided at any given moment to achieve reflexive control, but your underlying model of the information system.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
In order for
okay,
it to work, you have to have a very good underlying model of the information system. This is what the Soviets could never do. Right? They just simply were never able to develop really good enough models of the information system, and they still don't really have those. Now, artificial intelligence and the so much of our information system going online it makes it easier to actually observe and potentially build these Markov-like processes for reflexive control, at least at a high level, at a statistical level, right? You might be able to say, like, based on, I mean, you can already do this research in terms of, individualized advertising, right? You might be able to say, like, this kind of, if we feed this group of people this information, and we know we can feed it to them in this way because we understand the algorithmic feed and all these things, then X number of them will do this thing as a result.
Right.
Now, this is sort of quite hypothetical at this point. And I still think it's, at least I'd like to think that it's still too complicated to actually make function, at least in any serious way. But it certainly seems more plausible that you could do it now than 40 years ago.
John, this has been fascinating, and I think it certainly gives our audience a lot of stuff to think about. I've got a couple of typical wrap-up questions. Could you perhaps offer a fruitful research question that an interested student might explore if they want to dive into these kinds of concepts a little bit more?
I think one question might be, what is the relationship between homogeneity and distinction or heterogeneity in memetic systems? So, I think, there's a reason why a lot of internet people are so interested in the research of Rene Girard. And I think there's a lot to recommend thinking about that. What will it take to rebuild? What are the functional requirements of heterogeneity in an integrated communication system?
Lastly, you've mentioned several books already, but I'll just ask you: is there any other book or other online resource that might be related to the kinds of stuff we're talking about that somebody could check out?
Just because it's sort of on my mind. And actually, Dmitry Kofinas just had him on his podcast as well. My friend Jake Siegel's reporting in the Tablet on disinformation and sort of what it is and what it isn't, and its connection to sort of American politics and kind of global politics in the contemporary moment, I think is really worth your time.
Okay, great. Well, we'll put a link.
Jake Siegel at the Tablet.
Okay, great. Well, we'll find that and put a link to that in the show notes. Maybe Jake would also be a good
absolutely. You should absolutely have him on.
A
Absolutely.
Good future guest. All right,
another former Marine, if I'm remembering correctly.
Is that right? Okay.
Yes.
Well, even better. All right. Well, with that, wow, Jon Askonas, you've given us a lot to think about, and with that, Professor Jon Askonas, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks for having me on.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.